Right now, as you're watching this, seismic instruments beneath Mount Rainier are picking up exactly the kind of activity that puts scientists on alert, not because an eruption is imminent, but because this specific volcano carries a reputation that makes any uptick worth taking seriously. The US Geological Survey has directly called Mount Rainier potentially the most dangerous volcano in the entire Cascade Range, and it isn't because of its size or its eruption history. It's because of what happens to the roughly 80,000 people living in the valleys below it if the mountain's ice-covered flanks ever fail, with or without an actual eruption triggering it. Today, we're going to break down exactly what recent seismic activity has looked like at Rainier, why this particular volcano earns its dangerous reputation regardless of how quiet it currently is, and what scientists are actually watching for as new monitoring infrastructure comes online around the mountain. If you want to stay on top of this as new data comes in, subscribe and turn on notifications, because we track breaking volcanic activity constantly. Let's get into it. Let's start with the reputation itself, because it's genuinely counterintuitive until you understand the mechanism behind it. Mount Rainier last erupted roughly 1,000 years ago, and by the standard measures most people use to judge volcanic danger, eruption frequency, explosive violence, current alert level, it doesn't look particularly threatening at all. USGS currently keeps Rainier at volcano alert level normal, with an aviation color code of green, the lowest categories on both scales. The danger comes from something else entirely, the mountain itself. Mount Rainier stands 10 feet tall and is covered in more glacial ice than any other single peak in the contiguous United States. That ice sits on top of rock that's been chemically weakened over thousands of years by hydrothermal activity, hot water and gas circulating through the volcano's internal plumbing, slowly converting solid rock into weaker, clay-rich material in certain zones. That combination, a massive ice cap sitting on top of geologically compromised rock, is exactly the recipe for a specific and catastrophic hazard called a lahar, a fast-moving flow of mud, rock, and water that can travel down river valleys at speeds capable of outrunning a car, even without any actual eruption occurring at all. A large enough section of the mountain's flank could theoretically fail and generate a lahar purely from gravity and weakened rock, entirely independent of volcanic activity. That's precisely why Rainier's danger ranking has little to do with what the volcano is doing right now, and everything to do with what sits in its path if the worst-case scenario ever plays out. Major population centers, including parts of Tacoma and the Puyallup River Valley, sit directly within historical lahar deposits from Rainier's past. This means a large-scale lahar event today wouldn't just threaten remote wilderness. It would threaten tens of thousands of homes, businesses, and lives sitting on ground that geological evidence shows has already been buried by exactly this kind of flow multiple times in the mountain's past. Now let's get into the specific activity that's made headlines. Mount Rainier typically produces around 9 located earthquakes per month, occurring at a steady, unremarkable background rate. Only Mount St. Helens produces more seismic activity among Cascade Range volcanoes. Periodically, that background rate spikes into what scientists call a swarm, a cluster of earthquakes occurring in rapid succession in the same general area. And these swarms typically happen once or twice a year at Rainier, usually involving a relatively modest number of events. The most significant swarm in the volcano's modern monitoring history began on July 8, 2025, and it dramatically exceeded anything researchers had previously recorded there. Research geophysicist Alex Easy, who works at the USGS Cascades Volcano Observatory, described it directly as a larger swarm than anything scientists had seen since seismic monitoring began at Rainier. Using a technique called template matching, which allows researchers to detect earthquakes too small to be individually located through standard methods, seismologists at the Pacific Northwest Seismic Network eventually identified roughly 8,800 distinct seismic events tied to this single swarm, organized into 48 repeating earthquake families, patterns of very similar earthquakes recurring from essentially the same source location over time. Of those thousands of events, researchers were able to precisely locate about 1/350, with the swarm's peak intensity reaching 41 located events per hour in its opening hours, before gradually decaying over the following weeks. The largest single earthquake in the entire sequence reached only magnitude 2.4, small enough that, in Yezi's own words, even someone standing directly on the mountain wouldn't have been able to feel it. Beyond that historic 2025 event, Rainier has continued producing the kind of periodic swarm activity that's become part of its established pattern. A swarm in February 2021 produced nearly 20 earthquakes over about 5 hours, topping out at magnitude 2.5. The volcano recorded more than 500 earthquakes across all of 2024. And USGS's own most recent monitoring updates describe additional brief swarms as a temporary uptick against Rainier's normal background activity, consistent with a pattern the observatory has now documented across more than 4 decades of continuous seismic monitoring dating back to the early 1980s. Here's the piece of the story that genuinely reassured researchers rather than alarming them further, and it's worth understanding the process scientists went through to reach that conclusion. Following the historic 2025 swarm, USGS gas geochemists Christoph Kern and Laura Clore conducted the first volcanic gas observation flight at Mount Rainier since 1998, flying instruments over the mountain specifically to sample gases that might reveal what was actually driving the seismicity below. As the USGS itself described it, volcanic gas sampling functions much like a blood test helps a doctor diagnose a patient, revealing internal processes that aren't directly visible from the surface. Earthquakes near a volcano can stem from several distinct sources. Routine tectonic stress unrelated to the volcano itself, hydrothermal unrest involving the movement of hot water and gases through the mountain's plumbing, or, in the most concerning scenario, magmatic unrest involving actual molten rock moving toward the surface. Distinguishing between these possibilities is critical, because each implies a completely different level of hazard and a completely different recommended response. The gas sampling results, combined with the broader seismic data, pointed clearly toward hydrothermal activity as the driving mechanism, hot water and gases moving through and lubricating pre-existing fault structures within the basement rock underlying the volcano, rather than any indication of magma actively rising toward the surface. This finding is consistent with what researchers have documented as the cause behind essentially every significant swarm in Rainier's monitored history, including the smaller, more frequent swarms that occur most years without drawing significant public attention. It's worth being careful here because hydrothermal, not magmatic, is genuinely reassuring in terms of eruption risk. But it doesn't mean these processes are entirely disconnected from Rainier's broader hazard picture, particularly given what we've already covered about the Lahar risk this mountain carries independent of any actual eruption. The same hydrothermal fluids identified as driving these earthquake swarms are also the mechanism scientists believe has been chemically weakening rock within the volcanic edifice over very long timescales, the exact process that makes portions of Rainier's flanks structurally vulnerable to collapse in the first place. This is precisely why USGS and its partner agencies have invested heavily in monitoring infrastructure focused specifically on Lahar detection, entirely separate from the seismic network tracking earthquake swarms. New monitoring stations were installed specifically to help detect lahars, expanding scientists' capabilities to identify unrest and provide rapid notification to emergency officials and the public if a flow ever does begin moving down one of the river valleys draining the mountain. That infrastructure investment reflects an honest institutional acknowledgement that Rainier's most significant hazard isn't necessarily a dramatic, headline-generating eruption. It's the comparatively quiet, ongoing process of hydrothermal weakening that could eventually produce a catastrophic flank failure with or without any accompanying volcanic eruption at all. Rainier's monitoring network today is genuinely extensive, and understanding its scope helps explain why scientists can speak with real confidence about what current activity does and doesn't represent. The mountain is watched by a dense array of seismic, infrasound, GPS, and webcam stations, all positioned within about 20 kilometers of the summit, feeding continuous data to both the Pacific Northwest Seismic Network and the USGS Cascades Volcano Observatory around the clock. This isn't a recent development either. Rainier has been under continuous seismic monitoring since the early 1980s, giving researchers a genuinely deep historical baseline against which to measure any new activity, which is exactly how scientists were able to confidently identify the July 2025 swarm as unprecedented in the volcano's monitored history, rather than simply guessing based on incomplete data. Officials from the federal government have specifically toured the newly installed Lahar detection stations around the mountain, underscoring the priority being placed on this particular hazard pathway, even as the volcano's day-to-day seismic activity remains squarely within its established, historically documented range. Stepping back from the specific technical details, here's the honest, calibrated takeaway researchers themselves have emphasized throughout this entire period of elevated attention. Every significant swarm investigated at Mount Rainier, including the historic 2025 event, has been attributed to the same underlying hydrothermal mechanism, not magma movement, and the volcano's alert level has remained at normal and green throughout every one of these episodes without exception. That consistency across multiple independently investigated swarms over more than 4 decades of monitoring gives scientists genuine confidence in their current assessment, rather than confidence built on a single, potentially misleading data point. At the same time, researchers have been equally clear that this pattern of activity doesn't eliminate Rainier's underlying hazard profile. The mountain's combination of extensive glacial ice and hydrothermally weakened rock remains exactly what it's always been, a structural vulnerability that exists independent of whatever the current seismic swarm happens to be doing. That's precisely why the Lahar detection network continues expanding, even during periods when the volcano's seismicity sits well within normal background levels. The earthquake swarms and the Lahar risk are related, in the sense that hydrothermal fluids drive both, but they're not the same hazard, and monitoring one doesn't substitute for monitoring the other. If you live in the Puyallup River Valley, the Nisqually River Valley, or any of the other communities sitting within Rainier's historical Lahar hazard zones, this is a useful moment to make sure you understand your specific evacuation route, since lahars can move fast enough that advanced route familiarity matters more than real-time decision-making once a flow is actually detected. Pierce County and Washington State's emergency management agencies maintain detailed lahar hazard zone maps specifically for this purpose, and taking 20 minutes to review where your home or workplace sits relative to those zones is a genuinely worthwhile use of time, regardless of what the volcano's current seismic activity happens to be doing. Beyond that, the practical guidance here mirrors what we've said about other well-monitored volcanic systems on this channel. Sign up for USGS's Volcano notification service if you want direct updates on Rainier's status as it evolves, and trust the alert level system itself. When Rainier's status shifts to green and normal, as it has consistently throughout every documented swarm in its history, that reflects a real evidence-based assessment from an observatory with over 40 years of continuous data on this specific mountain, not a dismissive shrug in the face of uncertainty. Mount Rainier earns its reputation as the most dangerous volcano in the Cascade Range, not through frequent eruptions or explosive violence, but through the sheer scale of what sits directly in the path of its ice-covered, hydrothermally weakened flanks. The seismic swarms that periodically rattle the mountain, including the historic nearly 9,000 event sequence recorded in 2025, have consistently traced back to hydrothermal fluid movement rather than rising magma, and the volcano's alert level has never moved off normal and green throughout any of them. That consistency is genuinely reassuring, but it doesn't erase the underlying structural reality that makes Rainier dangerous in the first place, which is precisely why new lahar detection infrastructure keeps expanding around the mountain even during periods, like right now, when its seismic activity sits well within its own long-established historical range. We'll keep tracking any new activity at Rainier as it develops, along with updates on the expanding lahar monitoring network. Subscribe so you don't miss any of it. Drop a comment and tell me if you live anywhere near Mount Rainier, or if you've ever visited the national park yourself. I read every one of these. Stay curious, stay prepared, and I'll see you in the next one.